welcome back to Frankly Speaking in conjunction with the Knights of Christendom. And Anthony's joining here tonight. Hey, Anthony, I was going to take the day off today for podcasting because we've just been putting them out here at Knights of Christendom as well as over at Frankly Speaking quite, pretty much every day right now. Man, we've been busy. Lots of stories out there. But something popped up and, Anthony, I contacted you and said, listen, we got to talk about this because this is quite amazing as, we're living in strange times politically. And as there's a lot of faith being lost, not only in the political system, but really in the entire culture as a whole. And we've talked about it so much here before, the breakdown of family, the breakdown of culture, the abject corruption of the political system. And there was a show recently that me and you did about rationalism and the political right in America and how everything is reduced down to logic, reason, science, and politics. And yet, the more they kind of use these attributes to try and gain a foothold of a very liberal society that looks to become unhinged, there's us in the sort of monarchist, Catholic, integralist side that are saying, you cannot separate the supernatural from the natural here, right? We've seen a great moral breakdown, and the moral breakdown has been premised by the classical liberal civilization ousting the church out of power. And as we continue to go down this path of rationalism, the world has become completely unhinged with really no answers for the political right, all the way to the standpoint now that even the political right has lost all faith in the political system that they have praised and championed and in some respects have given to the world from origin, right? From this Enlightenment kind of classical liberal onset of the revolutionary periods of the 17th and 18th century. And here we are. Everything has gone wrong since those revolutions. And now they have no answers how to put the genie back in the bottle. And lo and behold, I'm listening to Tucker last night. He's got Jason Whitlock on, who is generally a sports commentator, Anthony, but he's also a social commentator as he generally speaks a lot about black issues in the black community and some political issues. He's a very wise guy, but he is a Protestant. But this is the conversation that Tucker and Jason Whitlock had yesterday. Let me play the clip.
What do you think? I've always wondered this. Like, what is the actual support for the ideas? Not, do you like Trump or Biden, but for example, do you think men can get pregnant? Or do you think some races are morally superior to other races? Like the core idea is the Democratic Party. How many Americans actually believe that stuff, would you guess?
I don't think 5% of America believes it. Maybe 10%. I don't know. So, Tucker, I'm going to say something that's difficult to unpack in this short amount of time, but it's what I truly believe. I think a lot of what the left supports is satanic. I'm just sorry. It's in direct objection to God and in direct objection to the Judeo-Christian values that were at the foundation of this country. And those Christian values are why we made so much progress in terms of freedom and humanity and the way we treat everybody. Yes, it was hard, but our Christian values compelled us to sacrifice our lives for the freedom of other Americans, of slaves. And through the civil rights movement, our Christian values compelled us to take risks and fight for equality and the equality of opportunity for everybody. I see a lot of what's going on here I'm just sorry, I'm a man of faith. I was raised in the church. This stuff is satanic. That's what's at the foundation of a lot of this stuff.
Well, I'm a pretty mild Protestant personally, but I completely agree with you. Especially the gender stuff. When you say you can change your own gender by wishing it, you're saying you're God. And that is satanic. I completely agree.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The political right, apparently rationalism isn't enough for them. Apparently logic and reason isn't enough for them anymore. They're starting to see the picture. Now, granted, there's lots of Protestant nuances mixed up in this conversation, but we've reached the point now where the political right understands that there's a darker element, as we've talked about so many times on this show, a dark satanic cloud hovering over the entire Western hemisphere at this point in history, and really all over the world, to be honest with you, Anthony. I mean, this is kind of where we're at right now. Is the right kind of starting to get it now? I mean, you know me, I've been on this show, I've been saying for a long time now, It's a satanic Democratic Party for all the critiques I get from my friends on the right that I always critique the right. No, the greatest insult I could ever give is to call somebody or associate them with Satanism. And that's what I've consistently done with the left in America. I think it is satanic. I think they are onto something here, but they don't quite see the entire picture. But I'm hopeful, my friend.
I'm hopeful as well. Of course, you have other right-wingers that are constantly calling out Tucker Carlson, for instance, for saying that the job of the government should be to promote the common good. And conservatives like Ben Shapiro disagree with that. Now, I would say that really Ben Shapiro is more of a libertarian. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the American people and the population out in flyover country that still holds some conservative values. Are they going to start calling this satanic? Are they going to ignore Ben Shapiro and embrace Tucker Carlson and some of his guests that he has on? And then, that would be a great step forward. Of course, past that, my friend, past that, we have to wake people up to the true, the good, and the beautiful of the Catholic faith. Because if we don't do that, we end up in the same conundrum. So at least they're making the first step forward. But they have to identify the greater problem. It was precisely that nebulous Judeo-Christian term that the gentleman used, which is a real part of the problem that we always talk about here. We've got to define what, if we're going to quote-unquote coexist as Protestants and Catholics, then we have to determine, and it's going to be mostly on the Protestant end, we've got to build a coalition. We've got to determine what really are the top 10 points of the faith. Or, as you might say, Frank, the bottom 10 points of the faith. What are the things we can certainly agree on? Can we look at Hungary and say, okay, well, these are the things that need to happen here? Now, of course, you had Tucker Carlson also in Hungary doing a story on Viktor Orban, which is incredible that this is even being done with confessional state, especially considering since many conservative outlets, which again, I would probably consider more libertarian leaning, think we've got to get Radio America back in there again. Never mind that countries like Hungary, Poland, even Russia are fixing the problems that conservatives are complaining about here in the United States. Well, how are they fixing those? Because they've decided, you know what, morality matters. Morality matters. We've got to have the bottom 10 points of the faith. We have to have some basics here. So, no, we're not going to allow for XYZ. We're not going to allow for the disordered lifestyle. We're not going to allow for abortion. We are banning pornography, and yes, Russia has done that. So these are the things that bring a civilization together, make it cohesive, make it possible to function. Our civilization at this point is fully dysfunctional. We see the full breakdown of the family. And really, it all goes back to this, again, nebulous idea of the Judeo-Christian principles, and it spiraled out of control from there. So at least they're talking about trying to take that step back.
Okay, Anthony. Well, let's talk about what they do get right on this. And then I think later on here in this cast, we could talk about what they get wrong. I think, obviously, they acknowledge a satanic elements. Now, what do they believe about Satanism, right? Because even this has come under attack within modernity, right? Is Satanism an idea? Like a guy like Dennis Prager has questioned for a long time. In fact, Dennis Prager finally came out and is, I guess, thinking about it, supposedly being a Jewish scholar, saying that he now may be starting to think, looking all the craziness all around the world, that Satan may actually be a real entity. And see, I guess that's the question, because with every Protestant, it's always a little different. I've met Protestants, those that call themselves Christians and go to church, that don't believe Satan is a real entity. It's an idea, for that matter. And I think this is why I say we have to define what true principles are first. And we have to get down to the basis of true religion in order to properly deal with Satan. If we're dealing with abstract ideas, if we're dealing with half-truths, this is where the devil, Satan, thrives and controls all of our lives. And it's been sort of this deviation away from truth, right? When they talk about, for example, Judeo-Christian principles, that's the first truth we have to figure out, right, Anthony? Because it wasn't Judeo-Christian in the old world. That is a concoction of the classical liberals who believe in religion from the standpoint of maintaining order in society. In fact, the faith of our ancestors was Christendom. It was Catholic. The entire world was Catholic. all the way up until the Protestant Reformation, where this split and this deviation away from the truth and the watering down of true principles began, the first of which, taking away the sacraments one by one, right? Luther did it, the Anglican Church did it, the Calvinists, I believe, got rid of all the sacraments. See, this is the point I'm making. There's an analogy of the faith that we have to trace back, that classical liberals have deviated from, that they don't want to get into. And so one of the big issues here for me is when they say Satan. Who is Satan, Anthony? How do we explain Satan to the world? And how does that fall in line with the idea that the left or there's a leftist movement that is associated with satanic principles, Anthony?
Well, if conservatives are going to now acknowledge as Satan as a real entity, and this is probably satanic influence, then the very first thing that we should be doing is trying to reach out to those conservatives as Catholics and building a coalition in order to eventually, one day in the future, start to move towards a confessional state. That is not going to happen right now, but this is the moment where we need to begin that process. Now, what they are going to have to decide for themselves is, okay, do we want a confessional state? Because if you're saying Satan is real and you think this is satanic, then the first place you better start looking is the satanic temples in this country that endorse Satanism, whether they actually believe in the entity of Satan or not. Because whether they do or not, who knows? They're fine with lying. Why shouldn't they lie? Right? So we can't really know. Okay, well, we're going to have to throw away parts of our precious Constitution in order to make that happen. Okay, if it's satanic, we have to get down to root causes. So at least that's something they can look at and say, yeah, it might be coming from there. But where else is it coming from? Who's enabling these groups? I mean, you can call it satanic, but at the end of the day, you have to get down to the fact that human beings run in packs. That's what we do. And you have to figure out, and let's be honest, all kinds of manipulation, deceit, and just hate out there among different groups. And so we have to get down to this ultimate manipulation. If other religious groups can be manipulated, who are they? Maybe we need to exclude them too. Maybe we need to say, no, this can't happen here because it's clearly destabilized our society to a point to where it is no longer functional. If you want to say the founding fathers used Judeo-Christian principles, which check out our last cast on that, in some sense they did, and in some sense they did not. But if that's the claim you want to make, then we need a new founding, don't we? Because they didn't found this country on Judeo-Christian principles. They founded this country on pluralism and that everything is open. Everything is open, including Satanism. So if you want to identify these problems as satanic, that's where we need to start.
This nation was not only founded on pluralism, but it was also founded on Freemasonry. Now let's talk about that for a second, what that means. Protestantism began sort of the watering down of the Christian faith by breaking from Rome, the Catholic Church, and by inscribing sort of this idea that every individual could find God on his own via sola scriptura, aka the Bible alone. And yet it wasn't really even 200 years. So after Masonry comes around and says, you know what, we're going to take that a step further. Not only through the various Christian sects do we find truth now, apart from sort of a mainstay church that was founded that you could trace back to the 2,000-year knowledge of the faith. But we're going to start to include all religions, not just Christianity. And this is why I've always said there's always been a symbiotic relationship between Protestantism and Freemasonry because they both accepted pluralism to a certain extent. Of course, Protestants only accept Christianity. But once you start to go down the path to accept any pluralism, specifically within a realm of, religious schismatic principles now that were being concocted between the 16th and 18th century, it's only going to lead to the natural conclusion that more religions can be encompassed, and as many as you can. Once you start going the path down of schism, there's no stopping at that point. And the Masons included all forms of religion, including Satanism. Now, they may not overtly state that, but that has been the natural fruition of religious liberty as enshrined in the American Constitution. This is why there's no stopping the satanic temples now at this point in history. They're popping up all over the place. They're becoming common ground. They're protesting. And guess what? They're using the long arm of the law, which is AKA the Constitution, to argue for what? The constitutional rights of religious liberty. Now, what do we do about that? Again, it's a question I keep asking my friends on the right. What do we do about Satanism? Is it just one of the many different religions? Or is it actually evil, and does it cause problems in our society? If it does cause problems, Satan does cause problems and divisions in our society and brings about these principles that bring chaos to society, then we have to stop it, don't we? But again, we got these constitutional principles that say religious liberty. Now, the founding fathers probably didn't imagine that we get to a point where Satanism would become a mainstay belief in civilization. And why? Because we're coming off the heels of a Catholic world that kept the moral principles of truth. They kept moral order, right? But once we break away from that moral order, we survive the next couple hundred years on the fumes of Catholicism. So even during the times of the founding fathers, it was probably never even imaginable that in America at some point we see satanic temples. Satanic temples, right? It was a far-fetched kind of idea, or far-fetched slippery slope idea that would never be possible in America, but here we are. And my point is, those Enlightenment principles, these abstract ideas of man's rights and individualism and do what you want, and I'm an American, kiss my butt, nobody tells me what to do, there is no authority higher than me, myself, and I, they've come full circle. And it's led to Americans using the Constitution, welcoming Satan into our culture. And look where we're at. Where conservatives, right-wingers, classical liberals are looking around saying, what the hell has happened to our country? Are we demonically possessed? Because when you look at America, it's come to, as I said so many times before, endorse, legislate, fund, celebrate, and ship oversee every vice that the world has ever known, that was ever revealed through sacred tradition, and now we've even gone so far to enshrine Satan in a place of honor, equivalent to that of the one true triune God and Jesus Christ our King. And what is the classical liberal answer for this? They don't have none, other than go back to the well and thump a constitution that has led us down this path, Anthony.
Okay, Frank, you bring up Freemasonry. We're getting into some deep stuff now. So I think what best highlights this, and I would encourage people to check out the documentary I did. You can find that on our YouTube page. It's called Our Lady of America, Hieroglyphic Warfare. I specifically get into some of the information we have from Freemasonry there. But to get into Albert Pike a little bit right now, Albert Pike wrote the Freemasonic text, Morals and Dogma, and I believe it was 1871. And recently, a lot of other Masons have tried to come out and put out there on the internet this information, essentially exonerating him to some degree of some of the things he has said. They have actually used the word slander because people have said, well, he was a Luciferian and it's a misunderstanding. Well, if it's a misunderstanding, it's not slander, but of course, the misunderstanding really wasn't too far off. So, of course, if I've ever said anything about him on any of our other casts, and it's possible that I have, I am, of course, sorry if I said anything that detracted from his name in any way. However, the problem here is he can't be fully exonerated from this idea, because in Morals and Dogma, he refers to Satan as a force, not an entity, but a force. And he says that it's been mischaracterized, okay? Satan was mischaracterized. But on the other hand, he also, in the same text, does refer to him as a God. And he refers to what I'm assuming is also the Hebrew God as well. I believe he calls him Adonai. And it's really kind of a flip-flop. He's saying Lucifer is the true God, or this force is the true God. And this is what brings about true liberty. Okay, so again, this idea of liberty in the American sense, which we see goes back to this, supposed philosophical concept of Luciferianism. But this is the very point that I think many Catholics and Christians are making when it comes to this, is that you can't just have a philosophical notion of him. They have an atheistic notion of him, just like atheistic Satanists that say, well, Satan's not really real, but we agree with this kind of philosophical outlook. And Pike really goes further. He really questions the Jews and, okay, how could they have just had this knowledge in Palestine? Weren't there good men worshiping in these pagan temples? And he names off the pagan temples. It's very odd, but he's saying that this is the force, this Luciferian force is what the Masons should embrace. So in a roundabout way, the guy is saying that Lucifer, or this force, or whatever you want to call it, is actually God, and it's the truth, and it's something that they should go towards and worship. And he does refer to it as knowledge at the end of the day. Well, isn't it interesting that in Scripture, that when man first sins, right, he gets the knowledge of good and evil. And knowledge is not an end of itself. It never will be. We have so much knowledge in our day and age right now. We have more knowledge than we can handle. And look at what's happening to the world, my friend.
Okay, Anthony, let's stop there for a moment, because I think most Americans are going to say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about, America and Satanism and how it's embedded? Because, really for that matter, we look at the history of the country, as we talked about our last podcast, the Founding Fathers were religious men. Now, granted, they were probably not Orthodox, as we made the case, but they had the fundamentals of Christianity, understood who Jesus Christ was. Most of them referenced Jesus Christ in some capacity or not. Now, that, again, as we made the point in our last show, is a matter of orthodoxy and whether orthodoxy matters to Americans in that respect. Now, I would argue, of course, that the lack of orthodoxy that the Founding Fathers have, because I do believe they were not Orthodox, is what kind of gets the ball rolling into this abstract kind of pluralistic notion of religion, right? But then, Anthony, we would have colleagues such as Timothy Gordon who would argue, I believe, that, in the Constitution, the First Amendment and the right to religious liberty is nothing more than an act of religious conscience, which is perfectly Catholic and in line with Catholic teaching, right? It doesn't necessarily enshrine Satanism or any other form of religion. Now, with Mr. Gordon, of course, is difficult because he will tell you how Protestantism eventually screws everything up. But in and of itself, religious liberty is not a problem, and it doesn't inherently bring in Satanism, because we still have the right and duty to pursue truth in that respect. When we attack religious liberty in that way, we're really stretching it out to say that religious liberty called upon really all these religions to call upon, when in fact it was just an act of conscience. What do you say about that?
You're really bringing out the heavy guns there. Good job playing devil's advocate, by the way. Well, I guess, obviously Satanism is not inherently enshrined, but religious liberty in the sense that the Founding Fathers permitted allows for it to be in competition with any other number of numerous religions and false gods. So, in that sense, what I think Timothy Gordon might fail to see, if he were to argue that, is that ultimately there has to be a winner at the end of the day. Things will not persist that way, because some of these religions that are permitted for actually want to dominate the system. That is, in fact, their goal. Now, why would you let somebody play the game, if the rules of the game being played are that we all get to practice our religion and we don't interfere with anybody else, then why would we permit religions like Islam or Satanism that in some cases actively seek to harm individuals? Yet that is protected by the Constitution itself. So ultimately, something will be enshrined, even if it wasn't initially enshrined. And I get the sense that the way the devil works, even if people like Pike didn't really understand the implications of what they were preaching, the implications are essentially that, the devil's tempting you to think, oh, well, you know what? It's all good. It's all the same. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And, everything will be fine without having some kind of definitive notion of what is proper and just worship of God in your civilization, and where the lines are in the sand for things that are certainly sins that cry out to heaven. Now, I don't want to get too far over into the weeds, but let's talk about that perfectly Catholic idea of religious conscience for just a moment. Now, it's true in the old world that we were already permitting people to exercise their religious conscience. We were not, for instance, the Jews lived among us. We've talked about this many times. You can look at France or numerous other examples where the Jews had their own neighborhood. They were allowed to worship the way they wanted to. Okay, that would be kind of you had kingdoms, it was Catholic monarchism, but it's kind of a confessional state, right? I mean, they were there, obviously at the pleasure of the king, but Catholics and the kings of those countries understood the true concept of religious liberty. It's not liberty, anything goes. This is a type of liberty with limits within what's just towards the one true triune God, right? So the Jews weren't going to try and destroy Catholic civilization. Now, you look at America, you fast forward, that is not the type of religious liberty we have here. We have a religious liberty where anything goes, and that's a problem. If I'm in some kind of a satanic cult or pagan cult or some kind of Wiccan cult, and I am calling down demons to attack you, well, you know what? The classical liberals might not believe in demonic hits like that, but they exist. They're true, and the church recognizes that. And that's the type of thing you can't have going on in civilization. Okay, any religion that would promote any type of harm towards other people is problematic. Yet our Constitution allows for that very notion. So if Mr. Gordon were to argue in the way that you suggest, I would simply point those things out. And I think they're true, and I don't think you can argue against them.
Okay, in all fairness, I want to stipulate that I believe that's Mr. Gordon's position. It's been a while since I listened to him. I remember when his book, Catholic Republic, came out. I listened to a few hours of his own show, Rules for Retrograde, and some of the interviews he did. And then, from my recollection, I believe his position is something close to that, right? I think me and you, Anthony, listened to an interview that they did on another show. I forgot the name of it now, where he talked about that. And so I hope I'm not mischaracterizing Mr. Gordon. If I am, I apologize. But that is a general belief out there that sort of contradicts sort of the integralist or the monarchist position oftentimes, and that is, the American Constitution was nothing more than giving everybody sort of the conscious act and not to justify all the various splits within Protestantism and eventually bring about all these pagan religions as well, too. My issue is this, is that the Constitution has been a bloody mess since the beginning in the sense that the interpretive principles of how government and the people themselves are going to interpret it really tells a lot about what really the American population and government believe the Constitution was stating. The fact that we began to see a rash of really kooky Protestant sects pop up almost immediately. And I mean within one generation of the American sort of enshrining of the Constitution, the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Campfire Preachers, and various forms of what are kind of extreme, unorthodox Christian religion only shows you and proves to you in light of history how the American people kind of accepted or viewed the First Amendment, the idea of religious liberty. Just look at how Americans reacted to it. This is why we have all these competing sects within Protestantism, and why many historians have noted that there is something especially different, kooky in a way, when it comes to American Protestantism. As I said in our last podcast, Anthony, with European Protestantism, they couldn't quite really break themselves from sort of the historical ties of the Catholic Church, so they had to keep some elements of Catholicism because of the history there, right? You just can't erase it. Europeans have culture, they have tradition, they have history, but in America it's quite different. We have very little of that. And so it became an experimental ground for everything, including religion, and you didn't need to tie yourself back to Europe in any kind of way. This is why for many years when I was in the classical liberal camp, classical liberals, conservatives made fun of the Europeans, right? Europeans, they stink, or Europeans, they're far more liberal than we are, or they're far less religious. These caricatures of sorts, because we're 200-300 years after the revolutions, we're multi-generational kind of families into this thing. Most people of European descent have forgotten that their ancestry that goes back to Europe, so it's easy to distance ourselves, because in many respects, as Americans with multi-generational sort of families now, we don't feel any obligation to the motherland or fatherland, whatever you want to call it. And this changes the nature of the relationship of everybody, including religion. So I would ask you, look at how Americans reacted in the early days when they read the Constitution. How did they find the principle of the First Amendment regarding religious liberty? They took it as, guess what? I get to believe anything I want. I get to find my own God. Even Glenn Beck says all the time, hey, don't let anybody tell you how you have a relationship with God. You are the only one that can determine how your relationship with God sort of exists or how it takes place. This is exactly what American Protestantism is, right? You're always renegotiating his covenant. Make it up as you go along. Your relationship with God is your business. You worship God any way you want. And so the enshrinement of religious liberty actually is played out exactly the way it was written, in my opinion. And then let's remember too, Anthony, here's another important point. When we talk about how the Puritans escaped religious persecution, right? They came to America to find religious freedom and liberty, right? It's one of the proud moments, or kind of the proud ideas that America was founded upon, right? The idea of religious freedom and religious liberty. Who were the Puritans running away from? Who were they? They were running away from the Church of England, another Protestant sect. So the idea of religious liberty was founded upon the notion of Protestant on Protestant crime. Now, see, I find that very interesting, Anthony, because you have competing European sects of Protestantism that make it to the land, they go to war against one another, and then when they get here, in order to try and resolve these schismatic problems within Protestantism, what is the natural answer for Protestants? More religious liberty, more schismatic acts, keep breaking apart. How do you keep peace within Protestantism? You break away. You break sort of the common good, the communal efforts of the faith, the communal principles of the faith for that matter. And this leads to a continuing sort of revolving door of schismatic movements and new religious, I don't call it orthodoxy, but new religious principles that continue to kind of build off one another. The schismatic schisms and sects continue to multiply decade after decade after decade, and look who we are. How can we not look in the light of history at the concept of American religious liberty and not say that it worked out perfectly the way it has come down the pipe for the past 250 years? Completely schismatic to such a degree. When you throw Freemasonry in there, they say, what the heck? It can't be just religious liberty of Christians. Let's throw all of them in there. Whether it's Islam, Hinduism, or even Satanism now. There is no argument against it, and this is why Satanists use the First Amendment to get their temples up. And now we wonder why, or question the notion if America now has been taken over by satanic influences? Really, Anthony?
Bingo, Frank. I could not have said it better myself. And when you look at the movie Anthony Hopkins did called The Rite, which is about an exorcist and it is based on a true story. As a matter of fact, an exorcist helped Anthony Hopkins train for the role. I cannot remember the name of the priest right now to save my life. But nonetheless, this priest does state, this exorcist, who is a priest in the Catholic Church, states that familial Satanism through the Illuminati is real, and that he has helped people escape it through exorcism and through, obviously, lots of counseling and getting through the kind of horrible things they went through. And he states quite unequivocally that the goal of this satanic cult is to take over the world. That is their goal. Okay, well, we know that. We know the Illuminati symbolism is very similar to Freemasonry. We know there are other groups under this umbrella that were actually controlling Freemasonry. Whether or not the Founding Fathers knew it or not, it's fairly clear that the initial intent here was not, as Pike states, that, it's just, well, Lucifer is just this force, and we should just coalesce around this force and knowledge, and humanity's going to take off to the stars, and we're going to, become some kind of cosmic being. I don't know. That's not what he says, but there's other kind of weird paganism mixed in with some of these people that followed Masonry as well. Not necessarily Pike himself. In any case, that is not the point. It's clear that the point was for this to fail in the first place, and it just so happened that because they had been undermining everything for so long that it became a vehicle for Protestantism to continue to schism. It's a very useful tool. And ultimately, it does lead to what we see at the end of the day. Yes, I would agree with Tucker's guest. I would agree 100%. This is satanic, what we're seeing happen in front of our eyes in the West. Oh, and by the way, when it comes to Timothy Gordon, I wouldn't put that past him as a potential line of argumentation that he might use, although I think that he may change angles given the argument that I'm presenting. So that would definitely be interesting. That would be fun.
Okay, well, Anthony, it's been an interesting discussion. I think we could go a lot further with this. And, part of the difficult, part of this discussion is very difficult, of course, is judging intentions, whether it's the intentions of the founders, whether it's the intentions of, the first Americans in that respect, and what they intended for the country. That's difficult. But clearly, as we talked about so many times before, once you go down the path of sort of pluralism, it really opens the door to any kind of belief that, really wants to present his dirty little head. I think it's, the idea, again, either you're with us or you're against us. And, I've heard the argument too, that when it comes to the satanic sort of temples, they say, well, they're not really Satanists, they're atheists is what they are. They're just kind of making a point. Well, not really. Because if you're not in favor of Christ, you're against Christ. That's just the bottom line. That's how these circle dictates of the faith have always laid out. There's no in between. We've known that for, well, again, that 2,000-year analogy of the faith. I guess my question is this: if the political right in America is willing to acknowledge that there are some supernatural elements at play here, if that's what they're really talking about, then what is the resolution to fix this problem here? Because you still have this problem of America effectively being a nation apart from a church, a national church in that respect. And as I said before, I believe a church and true religion and true faith has to play a role here. Now, is it going to be an uphill task, Anthony? Of course, when it comes to a nation that was founded upon these pluralistic ideas. And the discussions of the day are going to be difficult. And classical liberals have never wanted to talk about religion. The political right has never been invested in that, right? They've been invested about, the economic engine of prosperity, freedom, liberty. Let's all make the money together, and let's put a bunch of private property laws in place so we protect our stuff, because as Americans, we love our stuff. We've elevated our stuff as sort of a god in many respects, right? But look at America. I'm going to ask the question flat out, okay? And I know this is going to be a hard one to answer, but I'll say it before. You look at America today, it endorses, it legalizes, it funds, it celebrates, and ships overseas all the mortal sins ever condemned by sacred tradition. And if we're honest with ourselves, it's been doing that for a long time. Granted, maybe we've been leading up to, a peak point in regards to the loss of faith and the sort of adoption of all these vices that especially have been sort of, taking their place or a foothold here in the past 60 years. But is America a nation that could possibly be inspired by satanic elements? That's the question, because when you look at it, man, abortion on demand, disordered lifestyle, contraception, 2.1 kids, women going into the workforce. You look at all the problems of modernity, of America. America was the first of the Grand Masonic revolutions. It's led all of the West away from the old Catholic world and into this brave new world we call modernity. America was the first. America is the biggest and the baddest. And it's like I always say to my classical liberal friends, listen, if you guys are going to take credit for all this great technological innovation and the economic engine of prosperity, all the freedom and the liberty and all the great things that America has done, if we're number one at those things, though, don't we take the blame when things go wrong across the globe as well, too? America has been a leading force of influence. Take the good, take the bad, whatever you may have. We can acknowledge both. But the world is in a dark place. It's in a very dark place, Anthony. How much of a role has America played in the darkness that has presented itself within modernity?
Well, Frank, you're really throwing me the softballs this evening. I'll try and be concise on that, but first I want to revisit my previous point just to clarify, and that is I'm not saying that the Founding Fathers as a group or individually were founding this nation with the intent and the fruition of what we've seen today. I don't believe that was their intent. I think their intent was generally that they somehow thought we were just going to all go along and get along, and it was going to accommodate, kind of these different Protestant sects, as you bring up, and even Catholicism as it's here in the United States. Now, even the Founding Fathers that were Freemasons, not all of them were privy to the Illuminati. As a matter of fact, and I've said this in previous casts, but I want to use this to clarify, when John Adams found out that the Illuminati had infiltrated the Freemasons, he was very vocal about that and was warning the rest of the lodge members. However, what Adams did not realize is that the lodge was actually controlled by them from the very beginning. So there were a lot of good men, I think you could say, in the Freemasons as far as that goes. Obviously, the church has condemned Masonry or membership in Masonry, but you have to remember that where they were at their point in time and what they were born into and what they were doing. Now, all that to say, let's get to the main part of your question here, since I've clarified that. Clearly, I don't think the Founding Fathers necessarily set out as a whole to do this, although you could have infiltrators that were members of Masons that were also members of the Illuminati that knew exactly what the plan was. That's always a possibility. But on the whole, no, I don't think the Founding Fathers were about that or about what we've seen occur with this. I don't think they could foresee this. Now, your question, is it a satanic nation? Well, I would say yes and no. I would say no, it was not meant to be. I would say, yes, that is what it has turned into. I don't know what else to call it when you're murdering millions of babies every year. I don't know what else to call it when you've got the disordered lifestyle. I don't know what to call it when, natural law itself is subverted by the very courts in your state. The Supreme Court of the United States of this vast empire has decided that natural law is no longer law, and that they decide what the law is. And that, to me, when you're going against even the natural law itself, what else can it be but satanic? Because what is evil? Evil is just the absence of good. You have passed laws into effect that make allotment for the absence of good and enshrined it as if that itself is a good. It is total disorder and totally confused. It's all mass confusion. So, I would say right now, are we the worst nation that's ever been on the face of the earth? No, not necessarily. There's other nations out there that really, you look at communist Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, post-revolution, the millions that died there. But, we've seen these same fruits spread throughout the entire earth. And it's like Our Lady of Fatima said, Russia would spread her errors throughout the world. And she has. But these errors go back to classical liberalism. These are the errors of liberalism. And communism is just the final fruition of that. They planted the tree, it grew. And, we went through the baby stages here in the United States. We've gone through it slowly. But ultimately, we had all of the necessary ingredients for this to happen at the end of the day. And so we have to get focused. We have to meet up with our conservative brethren, I suppose you could say, on the other side of the aisle that are Protestants. We need to start figuring out what can we agree on. What are the bottom 10 points of the faith? Where can we go from here? We got to get rid of abortion, right? We got to make it completely illegal. This is a sin that cries out to heaven. We have to stop the disordered lifestyle enshrinement into law. That, it's a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. Can we at least get these things done? And at the end of the day, Frank, I think if we run into problems, obviously we will, but if we run into enough friction and resistance to those things, then this country is doomed, my friend. It's doomed. And we as Catholics have to step forward and we have to try and evangelize, make these conversions. We have to really push for the idea of a confessional state. Not that we're going to make that a part of a Republican Party platform. That's ridiculous. But what we need to do is start talking about it. The discussion needs to happen. Plans need to be drawn up with our brothers that we can reach out to in the Protestant arena that are at least willing to listen. Because if they see what's happening and they are calling it satanic, then they're primed. And right now is the time for us to make the first steps.
And very well said, my friend. It's a difficult time to be an American right now because we want to love her, this nation of ours. In some ways, it's been very good to us, without a doubt. But it's also a nation that, in recent years, well, as we've pointed out here so many times, Knights of Christendom, and frankly speaking, she is a nation and an ideology in peril. And I think a lot of it has to do with sort of its own ideological principles. I think its origins weren't thought out very well. And it appears now that the Prince of Darkness is reigning all over the world. There is a dark cloud over Western civilization. And as we point out here so many times before, we believe that, it began with the great rebellions of man against God, particularly against Holy Mother Church. I said it before and I'll say it again. I ask no different of my country than I ask of myself. What I do is I reflect, an act of contrition, I go to confession, and I try to repent of my sins, obviously, but also try to make those necessary changes so I'm out of the state of mortal sin. I ask the same of my nation, to reflect interiorly on itself and to fess up to the mistakes that it has made and ultimately to make the necessary changes that we need to make in order to make us a better, stronger nation. We love America. We all have something invested here. We're all born here. We're all raised here. We'll raise families here, and we will all die here in that respect. So we have something at stake here. Our critiques of America are for the love of America. Just like when I have to discipline my children or whatever it may be, we all have to understand right from wrong and determine where we go and what the right moves are. America has failed to honor the one true triune God, And it looks like some dark elements, a dark cloud has entered over this civilization. And not just America, I keep saying that. It's all of Western civilization, as this dark cloud encompasses everything and everybody at this point in history to such a degree that we've lost all forms of moral truth. And mankind and a nation in itself is broken to a degree that I'm not sure that we've ever seen throughout human history, right? Is America a satanically inspired nation? I would say that was never the intention, just like Anthony said. But I think it's devolved into something that we all should be very concerned about, and that we all, as proud and loyal Americans, make a great effort to turn this ship around. But before we turn the ship around, we have to get some moral principles of truth sort of out of the way. We have to have these discussions, and this is something that really both the left and the right have been unwilling to do, because we, I guess you could say, disagree on the very premises of what right and wrong is. And this is where America has gone wrong, because America never wanted to deal with right and wrong. America never wanted to deal with true faith and true religion. And with that, we've been thrown off course. Until we have these very difficult discussions, nothing is going to change. But we here at the Knights of Christendom, and frankly speaking, we're going to keep the conversation going and hold everybody accountable. And as good old-fashioned Catholics, we're going to hold everybody's feet to the fire. That's the way it's done, my friends. This is Frank. I want to thank my friend Anthony once again for joining me tonight. Signing off. Good night, everybody.